As former President Jacob Zuma made his court appearance last Friday, Prosecutor Billy Downer told the Durban High Court that the state was ready to prosecute. However, there are still a few issues to be dealt with, including the former president's application for a review of the decision to charge him. As Zuma's corruption charges relate to the arms deal of 1999, the case brings the subject under the spotlight yet again. So let's discuss this, and joining us to give us a little bit more insight into it from our parliamentary studios, we've got Henie Van Vuuren. He has authored many books on the arms deal, including Apartheid, Guns and Money, as well as The Devil in the Detail and How the Arms Deal Changed Everything. Henie, the expert on this arms deal, great to have you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne.
So, Henie, let's start off with something that our president has been saying over and over again. I mean, he has said that he welcomes his day in court. However, we get to the court day, which I think we all expect it to happen, for it to be delayed. It's going to now be moved up until June, and he basically wants the case to be reviewed. Why do you think? What's going on there?
Well, Leanne, I think it's important to recognize that for President Zuma, certainly the strategy has been to try and delay a legal process that I think more than any other scandal of corruption has the possibility of impeding his liberty. He could go to jail if he's found guilty of corruption in the arms deal, and the evidence is overwhelming that he and the companies that were involved are implicated in corruption. And so his legal team, Advocate J. Kemp and Michael Hulley, his attorney, have had this so-called Stalingrad strategy, slow the process down. And so we shouldn't forget that over the last 10 years, this is a deal that took place 20 years ago, but for the last 10 years, as long as the charges of corruption have hung over him, there have been attempts to ensure that it never made its way to court, and certainly pressure placed on public institutions to ensure that that never happened. But I think that it is a long-standing strategy where Mr. Zuma would say, outside of the courts, I want my day in court. But in fact, his lawyers do precisely the opposite. They fight hard as they can to make sure that their client doesn't have to appear in court. And perhaps that's what makes this appearance on Friday of Mr. Zuma and the representative of the French arms company Thales so incredibly remarkable, that despite these efforts, the matter is now in court.
Yeah, I mean, if we could spend a moment on that, because, I mean, you have always said and you've always felt that these international companies must also be brought to book. I mean, that's the reality on this. And then on Friday, we see one of the international companies' representative, Christine Guerrier, who's representing Tails manufacturer, sitting there with him. I mean, this has to give us a feeling of some sense of justice, just seeing these international companies being present too.
Absolutely, and I think we focus so much on the person of Jacob Zuma, and for some people that, of course, is it's part of their own political project. They have a particular distaste for Mr. Zuma and his politics. But I think we'd be missing a much bigger, much more important picture as to what's happening here. This is not only about Mr. Zuma. This is fundamentally about the course of justice in South Africa, and that justice cannot only apply to individuals and to politicians who've been implicated in very serious crimes. Certainly, the role of corporations as bribe payers is crucial here. We saw corporations actively busting sanctions, breaking the law during the apartheid period to supply weapons to the apartheid regime with the help of governments, intelligence agencies, banks, and other middlemen. And those same companies were amongst the group of, or at least some of those companies were amongst the companies that were awarded the contracts in the multi-billion rand arms deal of the late 1990s. So that 70 billion rand arms deal that was so, so mired in corruption and at every level. And certainly Thales is one of those companies where we have actual evidence that it is alleged to have paid the bribes to President Zuma, witnesses who were present when the money was paid, documentation, encrypted faxes that were provided that shows this. And crucially, therefore, it's about ensuring that the corporations who bribe the politicians in South Africa, other countries across the globe, are held to account equally. And Leanne, maybe I think an important point to make is some folks tend to focus so much on President Zuma that they almost argue that a company like Tails should just enter a plea bargain with the state and all should be forgiven for their testimony. testimony. But I think that would be incorrect. I think the message we need to send, that as a country, all are held equally before the law, including the big corporations. And we do that not only because it's of importance to a country like South Africa, but globally. These corporations pay these bribes that undermine newly democratic governments like South Africa across our own continent and elsewhere. And therefore, it's so fundamental that the issue of equality of the law applies.
Yeah. You know, one of the interesting comments that our former president did make was, you know, after the court appearance, speaking to his supporters, basically saying that he is left with the blame of the decision made by the government at the time. And in a way, we can look at it like that. And I want to expand a little bit on that conversation. What did you make of those comments of his?
Well, you know, I do think that blame shifting it wouldn't be something unique to former President Zuma. I think that that's something we see with the heads of big corporations, you know, right this past week or the past few weeks, the big scandals that have emerged, and exactly the same happens with senior politicians. And I think that it's unfortunate that Mr. Zuma doesn't want to take responsibility, where he, of course, is correct. He isn't the only one to blame. And I think that he's been made by some, you know, as the only scapegoat for corruption. There is certainly clear evidence that he was linked to corruption in the arms deal, and therefore I would argue needs to be held to account. But there are many other individuals, middlemen who live and walk around freely the streets of Johannesburg today, and the corporations, and of course senior politicians who now today argue that they knew nothing about corruption. Mr. Trevor Manuel, Mr. Thabo Mbeki, many others. I'm not suggesting they're all implicated in corruption, but they've always argued that this deal was clean, were it not for Mr. Zuma and his foibles in part. And I think that, again, the evidence shows that many of the other companies, the arms companies based on their own investigations in countries like Germany and the United Kingdom, British Aerospace, the very big corporations, even perhaps more mired in corruption than Thales alone, their own investigations showed that they paid bribes. So, you know, I think there is enough objective proof to say that there are many other politicians who want to make it appear as if their reputation cannot be tainted by this. And I think Mr. Zuma is correct. There should be others who need to be held to account. It cannot only be him.
I mean, let's look at the others, the supposed others, because I mean, the probability and the way we look at things right now, I mean, there is overwhelming evidence against him. And I mean, the charges that Zuma is facing now, from fraud to corruption, money laundering, racketeering, these could land him behind bars. Now, many predicting, and I think one of them, that has been following and being very much so after this, is Andrew Feinstein, which I'm sure you've spoken about ad nauseum. You know, he speaks about the fact that we could get to a point where Zuma reaches a deal and actually does become somebody that speaks out. He's threatened since 2005 that he's got a lot of information against so-called comrades of his that are also involved in all of this. And I mean, could we see him reaching a deal and actually saying, well, look, here we go, I'm going to give you all the evidence you need, and almost become kind of the state witness in all of this?
Well, I think there's the possibility that he could try and start at some point try and start a process through his attorneys with the National Prosecuting Authority to suggest this. But what we do know is that Mr. Zuma is not a person, from what we understand, after so many years of being mired in corruption in the arms deal, to have kept a huge amount of records on this. He certainly he has first-hand information and knowledge. But I do think that we shouldn't have, again, these kind of special deals that are cut. I do think that what would happen is we would slow down the process of justice. And again, the same that applies to Mr. Zuma should apply to the arms companies and others. But the information that he might have at his disposal definitely could point towards the involvement of key individuals. We don't know necessarily of the names of former cabinet members who've been implicated in corruption, but there are senior officials within government. We think of Mr. Chippy Sheikh, for example, who there have been strong allegations of corruption involving him and some of the German arms companies. Right now, we know that in a country like Sweden, there's an investigation investigation taking place about the arms deal company Saab, which was linked to British Aerospace, that is alleged to have paid a bribe. And the middleman for that payment is a man who today is the Swedish Prime Minister. So there are very senior people, not only in South Africa, but around the globe. Former President Sarkozy from France and President Jacques Chirac from France both put pressure on the National Prosecuting Authority through the President, in fact, at that time, President Zuma and President Mbeki, to drop all charge, the investigation of corruption into the activity of Thales. And I think, Leanne, what's important here is that we start to understand that this is not something that's limited only to the story of Mr. Zuma and Thales, but it has very important international connections as well. I think for us as South Africans is to appreciate the enormous pressure that our prosecutors have been under for years to make sure that they buckle and there is no justice in this. And I think, again, shows the enormity and the importance of us starting this process and rightly so, what other information could it unlock along the way?
Yeah. Let's take a very quick break, Henie. We'll wrap things up after this, so do stay with us. You as well, please stay with us so we can just wrap up the conversation with Henie Van Vuuren. He's in our parliamentary studios, so stay tuned.